So the Nintendo 3DS is almost at the end of its life, with factories shutting down around the world and the eShop officially closing early next year. There are still a few more games coming out for the system though. There's a game called Fragrant Story that's coming out in America physically very soon, as well as a few eShop exclusive games called Silver Falls. But in this video, I'm here to show you quite possibly the final physical release here in the UK. It's called Andro Dunos 2, and it was published by Pixel Heart. So let's find out whether Andro Dunos 2 is a fitting swan song for the system. Let's get started. So as you can see on the back of the box here, it actually has a special holographic sticker which tells you which number out of 6,000 copies the game is. And inside it has a few nice little extras as well. It has this nice little fold out instruction manual and a certificate of authenticity, which I was not expecting, so that's a really cool addition to the package. And now let's take a look at the game in action. So for a bit of context before we take a look at the new game, the original Andro Dunos was made by Visco and released on the Neo Geo way back in 1992, and that game goes for well over £1,000 these days. I did play it on the Mister last year, and I went back to play it again just before making this video to see how it compares to the sequel. It's honestly a pretty average shooter, with nothing that memorable outside of some fairly interesting power-up swapping mechanics. In 2020, Pixel Heart brought the rights to Visco's IPs and began to make reissues and repros of their past games. I was very surprised to hear that as well as a re-release of the original Andro Dunos, Pixel Heart actually announced a sequel too. Not only is this game out now on the 3DS, but it's also getting releases on the Dreamcast, of course, the Switch, Steam, Xbox One and PlayStation 4. I'll take a look a little bit later on in the video and compare it to the Switch version, which I also bought, but for now let's take a look at the 3DS game itself and see whether this game is an improvement on the original. Let's start with the gameplay. The gameplay is very similar to the original, with the most welcome addition of a super shot, which I kept forgetting to use. The interesting gimmicks with this game are the rotating special shots, and each of the basic shots can be leveled up, and they all have a different way of shooting and a different shield and missile style to go along with them, shown in the red and green writing next to the weapons section here. The weapons, missiles and shield can all be powered up individually, either by collecting the corresponding item within the stage, or you can actually assign the level up at the end of the stage depending on how many points you got throughout the level. Each weapon also has its own super shot, which is a super powered up version of the regular weapon. You can use it like a bomb to clear the screen and deal massive damage. After you've used the hyper shot, you have to wait until the recharge bar under your ship fills back up before you can use it again. I actually kept forgetting about this, so make sure to remember to use it to escape some dangerous situations, especially in the later stages, which can get really hectic. So the first weapon is a standard forward shooting shot, which grows in size as you power it up. This one is great for blasting through enemies straight ahead. This one also has front-facing shields and missiles that also fire straight ahead as well. The second weapon is one that fires both forwards and backwards. And third is my favourite weapon in the game, a green piercing laser, which as you level it up can begin to aim in multiple directions, coupled with rotating shields and a homing missile, which I always love in these kind of games. It also has a really cool screen clearing spin attack for its hyper mode. And the final weapon is another really useful one. This one can eventually shoot a burst of energy in all 8 directions, as well as having a good face on attack. The hyper for this one is a front facing attack that covers a large area. So as you can see, the weapon system is fantastic. Honestly, one of the best in this style of game in my opinion. There's also throughout the stage collectible blue orbs which increase your score at the end of the level. Apart from that though, it is a pretty standard shoot 'em up, with a few nice level designs which include multiple scrolling directions and some interesting backgrounds, as well as good enemy placement and great boss fights. The boss fights are a particular highlight for me, with interesting movement and bullet patterns. Plus, this boss at the end of level 3 reminds me a lot of the one from Kirby's Fun Pack. Maybe they played the game and got some inspiration here. Take a look for yourselves and see if you can see the similarity. The game begins fairly easy, and it's not really until level 3 onwards that you really begin to feel a challenge, but once it picks up, it can be a little bit frustrating with a lot of narrow corridors and limited movement options available to dodge some of the bigger enemies. Add into that the slow frame rate that you can see in this 3DS version, and it can become quite frustrating later on in the game. There are a few difficulty options though, and this definitely helps later on in the game, but it does make the beginning few stages kind of a slog to get through until you get to the more interesting stages. At least there's the option to select any stage that you've already beaten, so you don't have to begin all the way from the very simple first level every time you get a game over. There's also a few other options, such as how many lives you start with and what you want the controls to be like too. Apart from the frame rate and some of the annoying later stages, there's really nothing to complain about in terms of gameplay, and I love the weapon swapping mechanic. The game actually runs in stereoscopic 3D on the 3DS, and as well as just looking really cool, this actually impacts the gameplay too. Because of the layered effect of the backgrounds, it actually separates the sprites and the enemies from the background, so it's easier to see where you and the enemies are in position to the rest of the stage, and I'm just so glad that it takes advantage of this really unique feature of the 3DS. So I'm going to give gameplay a 4 out of 5. Next is graphics, and I'm sure you've noticed while watching, but there's something very wrong with this port of the game. The whole game has been stretched to fill the 5:3 aspect ratio of the 3DS, with no consideration as to how that would actually affect the sprites and the backgrounds themselves. It's even more apparent in the opening logos, where the names of the companies are actually barely legible. Compare this to the Switch version here and you'll see what I mean instantly. It really is a shame that they couldn't have kept the same scale and just extended the backgrounds a bit each side to make it fit the screen properly, or even just have black borders over each side. The problem becomes even more noticeable when the 3D is turned on. Obviously you won't be able to see this in the video, but if you look at the left or the right hand side of the screen, you can see where the background ends before it starts scrolling again, and in 3D it's actually quite off-putting. There's also unfortunately a few other weird things about the 3D effect which could have easily been fixed, such as being able to see behind the white screen at the end of the stage because it doesn't go all the way across the screen. And for example in this level here, where it looks like the enemies are actually floating in front of the scenery where they should actually be standing on it instead, and there's also one section where I think the buildings have been programmed wrong because it looks like the ones in the background are actually in front of the ones that are supposed to be in front of them, and that one really messed with my eyes. That's the only section where I had to turn the 3D off altogether. Scaling issues and awkward 3D aside though, the actual sprites and backgrounds themselves look great, with each stage having its own unique theme, and the scenery and environment flies past at such a fast pace, helping keep the game frantic and exhilarating to play. The enemies all look great too, especially the interesting boss designs. The bullets are mostly easy to see, and the different weapon types all look really interesting and powerful too. It's such a shame that there was a few issues with the 3D, because otherwise the effect is really cool. I love the way it layers the different sprites and you can really see into the distance, and it also helps with the gameplay as well, like I mentioned earlier. Overall, with the graphics, because of the issues that plague this 3DS version in particular, I'm going to have to give the graphics a 3 out of 5. But if I was talking about any of the other console versions, then it would be a 4 out of 5. But in this particular case, I really don't think I can give it any higher than a 3. And next is the audio. And audio is definitely a highlight of the game for me. I love the music here. It all has a really cool 80s synth sound to it, and the boss fight theme in particular sounds absolutely incredible. Honestly, I was actually sad the first time I beat the level 1 boss because of the awesome music. Have a listen. The stage music isn't quite as good, but it does fit the mood of the game really well, and it's pretty atmospheric too. The sound effects are all great, although they are a little generic, but they are well designed and not too loud either, which can be a problem in these types of games. Unfortunately, there are a few small issues with the sound as well, such as the fact that the tracks don't actually loop properly. It's not smooth and it will cut out awkwardly between the levels too. But that's more of a complaint about the technical aspect of the game, which I'll get to after this, rather than the audio itself. So overall, the audio, like I said, is definitely one of my favourite things about this game, so I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. Now, next is the technical aspects of the game, and as you've probably guessed, the game isn't exactly a technical showpiece for the system. In fact, it's actually quite bad, really bad even. First of all, there's an excruciatingly long loading screen at the start of the game, which is actually very uncommon for 3DS games, and after that you're greeted with the ugly pixelated and stretched company logos before being presented by a glitchy game logo which seems to have misplaced green pixels that are stuck into the background, and what's even weirder about this logo having those weird green dots is the fact that they're actually in a different place on the Switch version of the game, so I don't know what went wrong with the logo. Then, when the game begins, unfortunately you're greeted by a very pixelated image of someone in the cockpit of the spaceship on the bottom screen, which awkwardly animates as you move around. I have no idea why the quality of this image is so bad, and it's there throughout the entire game. It was a nice idea to have the animation on the bottom, but the execution and the low quality just makes it feel like a cheap afterthought rather than a neat little extra for the system. Then there's the terrible frame rate. One of the most important things to me when it comes to shooting games is the ability to quickly respond to oncoming bullets, but when the frame rate is this low it makes everything feel a little bit sluggish, and it's not very pleasing on the eyes either. Just compare the 3DS footage here to the same stage on the Switch and see how much smoother it is. Even the original on the Neo Geo ran at 60 frames a second, so I was really disappointed to see that the 3DS ran it this slow. The 3DS can do so much better than this. Even the original DS had plenty of shoot 'em ups that ran at 60 frames a second. It just makes the whole package feel rushed and not properly optimised for the system. And then, of course, there's the stretch screen, which makes everything look wrong. It also makes the font for the weapons at the top of the screen look blurry, and this problem is even worse with the 3D slider up, because when it splits the image between each eye, the text actually becomes a different size for each eye as well, so parts of the letters actually flicker. Like I said, the corner of the backgrounds flicker sometimes and you can see the stage behind where you're supposed to be. It all just feels very slapped together for the 3DS and certainly way below the quality I was hoping for, especially as most of these issues aren't present in other versions of the games. I would be really interested in checking out the Dreamcast version to see if that one has any of the issues that this one does. Honestly, it's one of the most disappointing and unoptimized experiences on the entire system. Even the original DS should be able to handle the game better than what we ended up with here. Just look at something like Nanostray, which manages to run at a super smooth 60 frames a second, and that game is in full 3D and on the original DS, which is a much weaker system. Honestly, I don't understand how it can be this bad. It feels like a game awkwardly running on an unoptimized emulator with some 3D effects added on as its only saving grace. I'm going to give Technical a 2 out of 5, and that is just because of the fairly decent implementation of the 3D, which of course is an exclusive thing for the system. Otherwise, everything else about this port is a 1 out of 5 for sure, and it really pains me to say that because I was really looking forward to this. And finally, Originality. And while the game isn't that original as a concept, it is actually pretty unique that an under-the-radar Neo Geo release from 1992 got a sequel in the first place, so I have to give it a point for that. Plus, like I said earlier, it has a really good and well-implemented weapon switching system, which rewards experimentation and replayability. I think the developer did a great job taking the original game and expanding on its ideas, creating a fantastic follow-up. It's also one of the only shoot-em-ups on the 3DS. I can only actually think of a few others. There's the excellent Steel Empire, which is a port of the Mega Drive original, which also included some really nice updated 2D sprite work and has the same amazing stereoscopic 3D layered backgrounds, except this one did manage to run at a constant 60 frames a second. And the only other shooters I can think of for the system are some Virtual Console releases or some remakes in the Sega 3D collection. So really, if you think about it, this is the only completely original horizontal scrolling 2D shooter for the 3DS, and that has to earn it an originality point on its own. So despite its technical shortcomings, it is a really unique game for the system, and I am very glad that it did actually get a release on it too. So I'm giving Originality a 3 out of 5. So my overall score for the game, taking into account all of the individual categories, is 16 out of 25, and turning that into a percentage gives us a final score of 64%. Let me know whether you agree or disagree, and let me know whether you've actually played this game down in the comments below. So overall, I am kind of conflicted with my feelings on Andro Dunos 2. On one hand, it's a really good end to a fantastic system, but on the other hand, they could have done a lot more to make this more optimised for the 3DS itself. Either way, I'm sure you'll agree that the game itself is really good, and I definitely recommend that you check it out on one of the other systems that it's released on. That's all for now. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and you want to support me and join all of the amazing people going across the bottom of the screen right now, then go ahead and check out my Patreon. Thank you so much to James and Kaylee for becoming my most recent supporters, and I will see you all very soon for the next episode. Goodbye.